Good morning, everyone. Well, while reading through Nehemiah as a church recently, I've been struck, I think as many people have, by Nehemiah's faithful leadership. Nehemiah is clearly and rightly the focus of the book, and his leadership provides us with an amazing example of prayerfulness, perseverance, and obedience. But looking with my Bible study at Nehemiah 7 last week, I began to wonder about all the others in the book, especially those who are only mentioned by family name and number. As Nisha read last week, it's a long list in Nehemiah 7. I'm not going to spend my whole midday reflection reading through the list, but feel welcome to turn to Nehemiah 7 and take a look if you want to. It says things like, the men of Bethlehem and Neophah, 188, of Anathoth, 128, of Beth Asmaveth, 42, and so on, each group listed in the tens or hundreds of thousands of people, each given their very own verse in the Bible. I have to admit that sometimes I skim read or skip lists like this in my reading, partly because of the difficulty of pronouncing things in a language I don't know, and partly because I don't really know how these lists apply to my life now. The list is basically an administrative record, a census, a record of those who returned from exile to Jerusalem. Somewhat thankfully for Bible readers today, they're not each recorded individually by name. But as we read this passage a few weeks ago, I wondered about the stories that lie behind those hard to pronounce names and numbers, the stories of the 42,360 people who came back to rebuild Jerusalem. And I think it's extraordinary that even if it's just by number, those ordinary stories of obedience, and one presumes sometimes doubt, are written into the Bible. The exiles mentioned in Nehemiah 7 have presumably sacrificed a great deal to return to Jerusalem. Nehemiah tells us in chapter 7, verse 1, that the houses in the city had not yet been rebuilt. Jerusalem was at risk of attack until the wall was up again. It seems to me that it was a great act of faithful obedience to return from a place of relative prosperity and stability to a city that was comparatively a wasteland and under threat. On top of this obedience, in verse 72, we read of the ordinary people's generosity, giving back financially to the work. After the amounts given by the leaders, verse 72 records that the total given by the rest of the people was 20,000 drachmas of gold, 2,000 minas of silver, and 67 garments for the priests. And although those 42,360 people are not named, I think that their obedience and generosity is clearly recorded in Scripture. I also wonder what it was like for those ordinary people rebuilding the wall, the families resettling into life in Jerusalem during the weeks when the wall was under construction. They were living under fear of attack, with people outside the city opposing Nehemiah and spreading rumours. There was dissent among the Jews themselves. This is just my imagination, but I'm pretty sure that if it were me, at some point, I would have probably thought that it would have been a better decision to stay where I was in exile, where life was more stable and perhaps not so difficult. Nehemiah tells us that in chapter 4, that even though they trusted his leadership, the people began to doubt in the face of the difficult work and opposition. They told Nehemiah that their strength was giving out. So I think the people's doubt is recorded in Scripture too, to some extent. The book of Nehemiah records ordinary people's obedience and fear, and the way that God worked through them to rebuild Jerusalem. This list of people reminds me, in a way, of the name of God first spoken by Hagar in the desert in Genesis 16, the God who sees. Hagar's another character, I think, who by human reasoning is really ordinary, even unimportant, and who might have been left out of the story of the Bible altogether. She was a servant and sinned against by Abraham's wife, Sarah. In Sarah's grief and frustration with God, who had not given her a child, Sarah asked Abraham to have a child with Hagar. When she fell pregnant, Hagar started to despise Sarah, and the relationship between those two women deteriorated to such a point that Hagar flees into the desert. But she wasn't forgotten. Beside a spring, the angel of the Lord finds her and speaks to her. And after that, Hagar responds and says, "You are the God who sees me." Knowing that God saw her and responded to her grief changes Hagar, and she returns to Abraham and bears him a son. It's all a bit of a strange and I think sad story. But today I want to focus on this name of God that I think is really important, the God who sees. Hagar is one of so many characters in the Bible who God sees. People with very ordinary lives who are spun into God's story in extraordinary ways and then recorded in Scripture. I think of Ruth and Naomi, of Esther, of David, Hannah, Zacchaeus, Mary and Joseph. I know that for me, it's easy to forget that these people that have become household names were really just living ordinary lives and got caught up in what God was doing. Most of the followers of God over the last thousands of years have been those faithful, ordinary ones who were caught up in God's story, who were never named in Scripture. And of course, since the Bible was finished, most of those who are caught up in God's story are not the ones that we read about in books or see in movies or even make sermon illustrations about. They're the ones who we never hear of. But I think there's some encouragement for me in this. Those faithful people in Nehemiah 7 who were recorded as a member of a numbered group returning from the exile were seen by God. I imagine that for those people returning, there were, as there are for me, days that just the work seemed too hard, or the children were cranky, or the weather was bad, or they seemed to not be able to make good decisions. And God saw them. God saw the days that they got up and responded with faith, the days that they didn't give up, or the day that they decided to give that bit of extra money to the work, the day that they decided not to stay in exile, but to take the big risk to go and rebuild. God saw the moments that were a mixture of faithful obedience and holding back a little bit in fear. And in his grace, all those moments were worked together for good as part of God's story. God sees the moments when we are generous and obedient and faithful. God sees the moments when, like Hagar, it's all too much and we give up and flee a situation. God sees our obedience and our sin, our weakness and our dependence on him. God sees us not in order to sort of catch us out in a secret sin and surprise us with a terrible punishment, but because he knows we are weak and he wants to heal and restore and forgive us. God sees our faithful obedience in small things that are so difficult and are perhaps the most faithful thing we do all week, even though no one sees. God sees all the times that we hold our tongues or speak up or try again or don't give up. God sees us just because we all are already caught up in his story just by living our ordinary lives as people created by him. To me, this list of 42,360 people in Nehemiah is encouraging because it reminds me that there's nothing and nobody so ordinary that God does not see it. Even though I'm sure the 42,359th person might not have felt like it every day, they're recorded in the census of people that rebuilt Jerusalem in the Bible. That's amazing. It reminds me that we too are caught up in God's story. We, of course, will never be written into Scripture, and we're not building a wall or a city that somebody will be able to see. But when I think about our ordinary lives of faith, I can imagine the Epiphany census, the list of families who he's graciously invited to build his kingdom in 2021. And I'm encouraged that God sees each of us and catches us up in his story today.